I'm Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press, and this is Ground Game. The coronavirus pandemic ranks among one of the most consequential stories ever covered by the Associated Press in its 170-year history. Here to take you inside the outbreak is AP's Ralph Russo.
From the Associated Press, this is Inside the Outbreak. I'm Ralph Russo. Today is Wednesday, April 29th. In the United States, the number of confirmed cases for COVID-19 has surpassed 1 million, and the death toll is steadily making its way to 60,000. On today's episode of Inside the Outbreak, we'll turn our attention to Brazil, which is showing signs of being the next global hotspot for coronavirus. We'll speak with David Biller, AP's news director in Brazil. The South American nation is dealing with what is now a three-headed crisis of the pandemic, an economic downturn, and an investigation of the president for abusing his power. David Biller is the news director for the Associated Press in Brazil. Thank you so much for joining me today, David. I know you are super busy, so let's dive right into it. And also, let me pull back the curtain for a second for our listeners to provide some relevant info. David was booked to come on and talk about how Brazil is becoming, by every indication, seems to be on the way to becoming a global hotspot for the coronavirus. Then right before we were scheduled to speak with Dave, the Supreme Court in Brazil announced an investigation into President Bolsonaro. So maybe we should start there because that's what you've been dealing with right now. Brazil is layering a political crisis on top of its public health and economic crisis. What's the latest, David?
Yeah, so it's busy days in Brazil. So the long and short of it is this: as far as the political crisis goes, Bolsonaro had a very popular justice minister named Sergio Moro. He was responsible for the big car wash corruption probe that jailed, among other people, former President Lula. He was someone who really kept Bolsonaro's base supportive. And ultimately, as it turns out, Bolsonaro wanted to change the head of the federal police. And according to Moro, he wanted to do it to put someone in charge with whom he could have close personal contact, someone who could share information with him. And so Moro resigned, and he alleged political interference, and that sparked, the makings of a political crisis. We have the prosecutor general requesting an investigation from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court authorized it late last night, and now Bolsonaro will be investigated for what exactly happened with Moro's exit.
So that has nothing necessarily to do with the public health crisis.
Well, it does and it doesn't.
Explain that, please. Yeah.
So here's the issue: is that right now everyone should theoretically be rowing in the same direction, with all efforts focused on addressing the coronavirus pandemic as it spreads in Brazil. But instead, what we now have is a political crisis that's brewing and is forcing the government to direct some of its efforts towards, or will force the government to direct some of its efforts towards this investigation. Congress that was trying to find solutions for the coronavirus, both the coronavirus pandemic and the economic knock-on effects. And now they may have to deal with the impact of this investigation. And if it does find crimes, would possibly have to launch an impeachment procedure. So this is, as you said, layering one crisis on top of another. And it's not that one is directly part of it, but it's also going to affect it. And lastly, one other thing, there's a lot of, attention on this political crisis. And what happens when something that was the big story, something dominating the news for several weeks, coronavirus, suddenly becomes, third, fourth, fifth page news. People believe that it's the worst is past and they can get a bit lax with their personal care, social distancing, wearing masks and all that. So all of these things do actually feed into one another.
So let's talk about where things stand with the outbreak in Brazil. Bolsonaro downplayed the severity of the virus. He called it a little flu. So it certainly seemed like he was not on the right track there. I mean, there was already some issues there with Bolsonaro and how the local government leaders were sort of taking control of certain situations. Where do things stand with the outbreak, and what is being done by government leaders to, I guess, push back on what the president's messaging has been and try to position the country to fight back against coronavirus?
So you're right. He did initially downplay. I shouldn't say initially. He downplayed it very early. He called it a little flu. He said people should deal with the crisis like men and not like little boys. You know, things that don't exactly jibe with what we're seeing from other leaders around the world. And he said it for weeks. His stance as far as social distancing measures and stay-at-home recommendations from governors was that they were too drastic, that they would inflict economic carnage that would be even worse than just allowing the virus to sort of run its course. He did want to isolate high risk Brazilians like the elderly and people with long-standing health issues, but he really is pushing for states to open back up, to get the economy going again. And he's meeting a lot of resistance from governors, and he met a lot of resistance from his former health minister, who he promptly fired and replaced with a new health minister who sees health and the economy as complementary. He says the new health minister, Nelson Teich, says he and Bolsonaro are completely aligned. The difference between Bolsonaro pushing for reopening and, say, France, which also has its plans, or I think I saw Spain also has a date when it hopes to reopen, is that Brazil is farther back on its curve, on its virus curve. It hasn't yet reached its peak. Its peak is still a couple weeks off at least. And so the proposal to reopen, if done, would be done as Brazil hits its peak.
As of right now, looking at the Johns Hopkins University data, Brazil has 68,000 cases. To give people some perspective, that's well behind China. But as you said, clearly Brazil is still sort of trending upwards. Are you seeing some of the same ominous signs in Brazil? Not enough hospital beds, maybe too many bodies to bury, that we have become unfortunately familiar with here in the US?
Yes, we have. And I would just say, before getting into that, I would say the data in Brazil, like in many other places, is very, very dubious. There are a group of researchers from the University of Sao Paulo, University of Brasilia, and elsewhere who think that there may be more than 1 million people currently infected in Brazil. The problem in Brazil, which you don't have as much or as drastic in the US, is a complete lack of testing. I mean, it really has been galling how many people are not getting tests, how many people are buried with death certificates that say suspected coronavirus, but that does not figure into the actual tally. When we see this 72,000 cases, this is also a snapshot of the past, because it takes time for these tests to be processed. And it can take, I talked to a doctor who said it takes as long as a month. I think most take 2 weeks or so. But so that number to begin with is significantly under what the true total is, according to experts. And then as far as the impact, yeah, we're seeing all kinds of things. I mean, aside from the fact that, I think last Friday, 6 of 7 hospitals treating coronavirus had their intensive care units filled. In Manaus, which is the biggest city in the Amazon, their ICUs were filled, and there were people with waiting lists, or on the waiting list, I should say. And the city started digging mass graves. So it's not just digging mass graves, but actually it stacked the coffins within the mass graves. So it was, instead of just laying the coffins on the bottom, they were stacking them three or four high. It's also, I should say, it's very difficult to get visibility on a lot of this, because Brazil is an enormous country. It's the size of continental Europe, and you have cities spread around. The focus right now is in Sao Paulo, but it does seem to be taking root in places like Manaus, in places like Fortaleza, which is the capital of Ceará state, or in Recife, in Pernambuco state. And these are cities much, much less prepared to rise to the challenge of facing hundreds of patients who need ventilators.
Okay, so you basically led me right to my next question, which is, when you talk about not ready to rise up to the challenge, give us a look at what, for people who maybe haven't traveled through Brazil, what's a major city look like in Brazil? I would imagine very densely populated, as opposed to some of the cities in the Amazon or some of the towns where, like, as you said, they're not quite ready for the challenge of a health crisis.
Right. Well, I would say that it varies mainly region to region. The Northeast is relatively poorer. The North, which is the Amazon, it has these cities hundreds and hundreds of miles away by boat. The South is wealthier and a bit older. So a lot of what it looks like varies based on which region it is in. I would say that maybe the common thread is that people have had a bit of second thoughts on the social distancing. They have a president who is encouraging them at every turn to get out, go back to work, telling them this virus is nothing to worry about. And that is, chipping away at the resilience of the governor's quarantine measures, government stay-at-home measures. So what you do see in the streets around Brazil is a bit of weakening of those measures. And experts say that that is only going to increase the risk of further infections going forward.
Was Bolsonaro a popular president? Well, is he a popular president now? Was he more popular before? Is any of his support eroding? Obviously, within the political circles, it is. He's being investigated. But how about from the citizenry?
So it's interesting. He thus far has seemed to maintain his base of about 33%. But what you are starting to see is that the people who have been, really disapproving of his handling of this health crisis, and who voted for him not because they loved him, but because they disliked the Workers' Party, which is former President Lula's party. They disliked that party so much that they voted for the alternative, which is Bolsonaro. And these tend to be wealthier, more educated Brazilians, people who are banking on Bolsonaro's administration to enact market-friendly reforms and shepherd the economy out of just economic doldrums. It's been 5 or 6 years since Brazil has had anything resembling significant GDP growth. For those people, the coronavirus crisis and Bolsonaro's handling of it that was the straw that broke the camel's back for them. And they really are not having it anymore. That doesn't mean his support has dropped all that much, but you do see increases in the percentage of people who, for example, want him to resign. That went up from, if I'm not mistaken, 37 to 45% from the start of last month to today or yesterday. So there is a lack of support already. It's weakening around the edges, and he's trying to shore up the support he has and galvanize his base. I mean, with the exit of Moro, what you saw, it was actually a bit of whiplash. You saw people who one day were defending Moro as a national hero for locking up the corrupt politicians found in the car wash investigation. And then, 24 hours later, they were villainizing him, saying he's a traitor and he only cared about his own reputation and so on. And so there is a very firm base that Bolsonaro has, and will probably, according to the experts and analysts speaking to, we'll probably see where that floor is.
The last question I'll ask you, David, is you talked about a lack of testing and how some of the social distancing restrictions are already sort of coming apart there. Is there any outside help, helping with hospitals, helping with, burying bodies, possibly testing coming? Is there any place Brazil can look to outside the country to provide some help within?
Do you mean from multilateral organizations or from other countries?
I would imagine from either other countries or multilateral organizations. I'm wondering if Bolsonaro is even in a position to do that, or if he was the type of person who would ask for help.
I admittedly do not know who would be rushing to help at this moment. I think in these sorts of circumstances, China would be a natural ally, considering that coronavirus moved on, and I've seen China helping other countries. They're not dealing with, the gravity of the problem the way the U.S. is at this current moment, so the U.S. wouldn't be necessarily in a position to help. The problem with China is that there's been two sort of diplomatic snafus, one set off by Bolsonaro's son and another set off by the education minister. And the first required a peacemaking phone call by Bolsonaro to President Xi. And the second one also, I believe, required some walking back of the comments by the education minister himself. And both of these were self-inflicted wounds. So as far as China goes, I don't think that, as far as I know, they're not helping. Other nations around Brazil are sort of watching what's happening with a bit of distance and also concern. Argentina's president made comments about that the other day, worried that Brazil's lack of care for the coronavirus or lack of concern for the coronavirus could wind up spilling over into its borders. Governor of Florida today said he was worried about Brazilians flying in. So I don't know who would be providing that help, but it doesn't seem like it's happening if it should be happening.
David Biller is the news director for the Associated Press in Brazil. Thank you so much for joining me today, David. I know you're super busy. I appreciate you squeezing out a little time. Also, please stay healthy and stay safe. It does sort of sound like things are going to get worse before they get better where you are.
Thank you very much, Ralph.
At apnews.com, today's One Good Thing feature is about a former baseball manager. Clint Hurdle began sending his daily notes of inspiration more than 10 years ago, during his days managing the Colorado Rockies. They were a simple and small way of checking in with everybody on his staff. Now, during a pandemic, what used to be a group text message has turned into much, much more. Every morning, Hurdle's daily encouragement email go out to some 5,000 eager recipients. You can read that story and get all of AP's coronavirus outbreak news coverage at apnews.com.
That's it for this episode of Ground Game. We'll be here every step of the way during this extraordinary moment in American politics and American life, giving you all the news you need to know. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. Some of the details of our discussion may have changed by the time you hear this. For up-to-date developments on all of your news, head over to apnews.com. From the Westwood One Podcast Network.